It's our weekly Wednesday politics episode, and we're taking a look at a curfew bill aimed at curbing violence around businesses in Kensington, Germantown, Mount Airy, and parts of North Philly. If the bill becomes law, businesses in these neighborhoods would be forced to close between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. It's a crackdown on what the city calls nuisance businesses. But a group of business leaders don't want this curfew. They say it's going to hurt the way they make money. So can curfews make our city safer? I'm sitting down with Isaac Avalucia, reporter at Axios Philadelphia. It's Wednesday, August 27th. I'm Trini Nuri, and we're talking politics. Isaac, I want to start in Kensington before we get into the other neighborhoods. We've been seeing efforts from Mayor Sherrell Parker's administration and from Councilmember Ketsi Lozada cleaning up the neighborhood. We've seen street sweeps, a wellness court, and now a possible expanded curfew zone in several other neighborhoods. What's the history here of curfews in Kensington?
Yeah, so Councilwoman Ketsi Lozada proposed a bill last year that actually passed, right? And there is a limited curfew in place in Kensington right now. And it was basically this pilot program to see, is this an effective way to cut down on some of those issues that you're talking about? The nuisance businesses, the rise in crime, the homicides, right? And I talked to Miss Lozada and she told me, look, homicides are down. They're not at a historic low, but they're trending in a good direction, right? Halfway through the year, we were on track to have less than 300 murders for the second year in a row. Now, I think where she makes a little bit of a mistake is drawing a causal line between these business curfews and this reduction in crime. But, that's what a politician is often they're going to do. They're going to point to something that they've proposed and say, well, that's the reason that we're seeing this trend line decline in homicides. But I think that is an oversimplification, right? Because there are a lot of factors that go into why we're seeing fewer homicides, why we're seeing less crime in that Kensington area, which is her backing for continuing to support the expansion of these business curfews, right? And according to the Institute for Justice, which is spearheading this effort by business owners to push back against this expanded business curfew, they're saying it's going to expand that business curfew zone by 500% to some of those communities are talking about. North Philadelphia, Germantown, Mount Airy, which is the home of the mayor. Mount Airy's Business Improvement District actually sent a letter to Councilwoman Bass saying, hey, we're opposed to these expanded curfews. It's going to potentially lead to an exodus of businesses in our area. And they point specifically to places that would get swept up or possibly get swept up, like your Wawas, right? Your convenience centers that are serving people throughout the night and stuff like that. Now, there are exceptions to this law. We're talking about restaurants that have liquor licenses, gas stations, and places that primarily serve through a drive-through. So those are some of the carve-outs. But the argument from the business owners is, look, like you're using a hammer when you should be using a scalpel to try to address this issue. And you're potentially going to see an exodus of businesses like your Wawa who have already migrated outside of the city because some of those very crime issues that we're talking about.
We're going to talk more about how the business community is responding. But I want to ask, why are they expanding the curfew to Germantown and Mount Airy and parts of North Philly?
Like I said, it's basically this idea that it worked in Kensington, or that's the argument, right? It worked in Kensington. We're seeing a decline in homicides. We're seeing fewer crimes, and this community is seeing some semblance of improvement. Well, let's expand it to other areas that have been traditionally crime hotspots and see if we can replicate those results. That's basically the argument that Ms. Lozada is making. And really the pushback from the business community is, again, you're using a blanket formula to try to address these issues. And these aren't necessarily issues that are exactly happening all the time outside of our businesses, right?
Right, because I was just going to say, Could the rest of the city eventually see a curfew? Because I can't imagine one of these types of curfews in Center City.
I think a Center City has a lot more clout, right? And I think what you're touching on is the exact issue that some of these uh, uh, businesses are touching upon, right? This area has been disproportionately impacted by crime, disproportionately impacted by poverty, and you're actually exacerbating some of those issues by enforcing a curfew like that. The thing that I think city lawmakers would say, well, you have to implement a strategy in places that have historically been crime hotspots. Is Center City historically a crime hotspot? I think they would. The answer to that would be no, right? Center City has seen its own issues in terms of retail theft, but is it a violent crime hotspot? I think most city lawmakers would say no, absolutely not. And we
Right.
have to put these types of policies in place in those places where we are seeing more types of violent crime.
Like I said, the curfew would be from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. What happens if you violate the curfew? Who's on the hook? The businesses or the people using those businesses?
It's the businesses, right? And we're talking about $1,000 fines for any sort of violations of those curfews, which are more substantial. And that was part of Ms. Lozada's bill to increase those fines from $500 to $1,000. And these are potentially stiff fines for these businesses who are saying, "Hey, look, this business curfew is already going to cut into our margins, and then on top of that, if we violate it in any way, shape, or form, we're on the hook for that." And I talked to one business owner who owns a pharmacy in that area. And while he typically doesn't operate beyond what the curfew hours would be, he said, look, I could get jammed up in that because there's a little bit of a gray space in that law. And we do technically operate some of our services after that 11 p.m. Curfew, right? They're talking about they provide medicines and services to some of the local hospices after 11 p.m. And that's an essential service that they need to provide to those hospices. And he's
Interesting.
worried, look, the city could say, hey, well, technically you're operating after the business curfew and we're going to fine you.
Right. So back in April, I actually sat down and spoke with Councilmember Cindy Bass, who you mentioned earlier. She represents the 8th District. She was tackling the same issues, those nuisance businesses in her district, by pushing the city to shut them down. Why doesn't Councilmember Ketsi Lozada maybe do something similar where it's just focusing on the nuisance businesses rather than the pharmacies and the Wawas? Because we don't want to lose those businesses in our communities.
I think the problem is that how do you define a nuisance business, right? And different people might have different definitions. Some people have pointed to those stop and go shops with the problem gambling and the skill games. For some people, it might be some of these places that have alcohol licenses and are selling liquor at all hours of the night, right? It's really difficult to tamp down on exactly what you think a nuisance business is. I think that will require more investigation and really getting a lot of data on that. And right now, I think that's the biggest problem that some of these business owners are pointing to, the relative lack of data, right? We have a whole body of research that pertains in particular to juvenile curfews and the literature on that. If you read places like Time Magazine and the like, they say researchers have found these juvenile curfews do not work. Can we extrapolate those same types of findings for business curfews? I think we're lacking a little bit in the data department to make that argument per se, but that's the argument that the business community is making in essence. Well, these don't work for juveniles. Why would they work for an adult population that is, facing some of the same issues? We're talking about in that particular district, District 7 and 8, we're talking about 3,000 businesses in those districts, about 800 of which operate in the food, hospitality, and retail sector. The sticking point is we don't know how many of those businesses would be operating or do operate typically in those curfew hours. So we have no way of really knowing what the true impact of these crackdown would in fact be. And I think that's an important thing to know, right? You have to know, well, what is the global proposition of the impact in order to really zero in and focus on, well, how much money is that going to calculate to? What are those losses for those businesses? And can we do something that's more tailored to actually getting to the core of the problem?
All right, let's keep talking about this after the break. So Isaac, you told me a little bit about, some of the pushback and the arguments that business owners are saying here. What about like just regular residents? How do they feel about this idea of the curfews on businesses?
I think it depends on who you ask, right? But Miss Lozada is going to point to all those constituents that she's talked to in her neighborhood and her district who say, look, I want you to do something about violent crime. I want you to do something about those nuisance businesses that they feel are having an impact on their quality of life, on their ability to just go outside their steps every morning or in the early evening and not be bludgeoned by all these really awful issues, right? I've heard stories about, people walking out and seeing people right in front of them shooting up and doing some of the drugs and fentanyl. And Kensington has unfortunately had a reputation for being a open market drug area for a long, long time.
Right.
So those are the types of issues that Ms. Lozada is going to point to and say, look, I am duty bound to represent my district and put forth policies that my constituents, by and large, back. Right now, I think she's in a little bit better of a position to say what people in her district are telling her, but she also can't ignore that there are a lot of people, also business owners in her district, that are saying the exact opposite. So, how do you reconcile those two competing interests? It's a very tough question, but Ms. Lozada says unless there is some sort of uh, data point or something definitive to say, hey, this strategy isn't working, she's not planning on backing down.
Tell me a little bit about the Institute for Justice public interest law firm that is supporting the business owners.
Yeah, absolutely. They're what I call the spear of this issue, right? And I think that they're taking a little bit different tact on this particular issue because it's been an issue that has been challenged in the past before. Just last year, I had reported that a group of Arab and Asian businesses were similarly attacking the initial curfew. They felt like it was arbitrary, that it was far reaching, and that the implications were big on them, right? They actually filed a lawsuit challenging the state and the city on this very issue, but the judge felt like they weren't able to demonstrate actual damages. And that judge actually tossed out the lawsuit because they didn't feel the pleadings were specific enough to show how that particular strategy was impacting some of those business owners that were plaintiffs in the lawsuit. So I think Institute of Justice is taking a little bit of a different tact, maybe in light of that, maybe in terms of, hey, let's put forth a public pressure campaign, which sometimes can be a very effective cudgel when you're trying to impart what you're trying to do on council members. And so they organized these business owners. They had a news conference last week where they're talking about the real life impact on their businesses. They had, somebody from a food truck, a chef from a food truck that says, hey, look, this is going to eat into my margins. So you're really kind of trying to make that emotional appeal to the community and to the city lawmakers that, hey, there's another segment of our community that you're really not considering when you're putting forth these business curfews.
We talked about the curfews for the young people in the city. Those who are 13 and younger, they've got to be home by 9:30. 14 to 17, they've got to be home by 10. So the research, like you said, it shows that those types of curfews don't even work for kids, let alone we're not sure yet for the businesses. So has the city tried other methods to curb the nuisance business issue? Did those ways just not work?
It's a great question, right? And I wish I had a very simple answer to it. But I think what you're seeing is a lot of strategies. And I think that's where the hangup is, right? Ms. Lozada wants to point to one or two things, and it's really a comprehensive strategy that is being deployed right now to account for some of these steep declines in homicides, right? We reached a peak during the pandemic, and then we've seen a reprieve from that in the last couple years. But there's a multitude of reasons for that. It's not just business curfews, even if you want to make that argument that they had an impact, right? It's a lot of things. It's things like the data-based a pinpoint strategy that Commissioner Kevin Bethel has emphasized, where you're really going to those 8 to 10 hotspots that are accounted for a lion's share of the slice of violent crime in the city, and really putting more officers in those areas to defray disputes before they happen, or intervene more quickly so they don't escalate, or there's at least a rapid response when there is an unfortunate circumstance. It's those types of policies. It's some of the other things that the Parker administration feels have been successful. It's a total picture. It's not just, there's not one thing that is a silver bullet that you can sit there and point to and say, hey, this is strategically why we've seen X, in this case, a decline in homicides or a decline in violent crime in that particular area. And I think that's really where business owners are pushing back and pointing out the hypocrisy and trying to make this causal argument that business curfews have led to this stark reduction in crime.
Is Mayor Parker expected to sign this?
If you believe Ms. Lozada, yes, right? She says that, and I think there's some things that you can point to and say, well, she supported the last one, right? And her administration, and she's been out forefront about getting tougher on crime, cracking down on these nuisance businesses, cleaning up Kensington, and really trying to address those quality of life issues that Ms. Lozada points to that are important to residents in her community, right? She says she's not making a push for anything that isn't backed by many of those citizens in those communities, that they want this addressed. They've been beckoning for this to be addressed. And these are some of the policies she's putting forward, not just because she thinks it's a good idea in and of herself, but these are things that her constituents want, right? But I think the pushback would be, well, some of those constituents you're talking about are those very business owners in those communities. And they're saying, look, we don't want that.
We are looking for this to possibly go into effect September 11th. So this is around the corner.
Absolutely. It's around the corner. And we'll continue to see what Institute of Justice does in the coming weeks. But they said they're not done, right? They're planning to continue to canvass these businesses, canvass these areas, and gain that grassroots support so they can have a unified voice against this, to continue to press upon city councilors to potentially repeal this bill before it goes into effect. But if Ms. Lozada is any indication of how council members feel, I think there's a slim to none chance that they reconsider their position.
Isaac Avalusi, a reporter at Axios Philadelphia. Thank you for breaking this all down with me on CityCast Philly today.
Thank you, Trinae.
Do you have a business or live in Germantown, Kensington, Mount Airy, or parts of North Philly? Let us know. Hit us up at 215-259-8170. That's all for today here on CityCast Philly. Let us know what you think of this episode, especially about the whole idea of curfews for businesses. Do you have a business or live in Germantown, Kensington, Mount Airy, or parts of North Philly? Let us know what you think. You can call or text us at 215-259-8170. Share this episode with one of your neighbors and rate the show. Leave us a review and hit that subscribe button. Be sure to sign up for our morning newsletter, Hey Philly, to learn more about what else Philly's talking about. And don't forget, you can support this show and get great perks by becoming one of our neighbors, a CityCast Philly neighbor at membership.citycast.fm. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.